All right, this is NextWar Taiwan. And there's Max. Max has come into the game room to be a trip hazard. Say hi to everyone, Max. So what we got going on here is things are going horribly wrong for the Allies. And most of that is due, in fact, due to the seizure of ports on turn one and the fact that the Allies have not been able to destroy those ports. And so those ports are able to bring units in at alarming rate. One unit every single movement phase, basically, for each of those two ports. And so that's gotten elements of three different corps over to the island of Taiwan. And so pressure is being built in two different directions along the western coastal plain of the island of Taiwan. So the Allies here are basically using their 10th Corps to fall back on Kaohsiung. They don't have offensive capability. The limited attacks they did on turn one were repulsed, and so they are basically in a purely defensive posture. Elements, sorry, I think that was 8th Corps over there. 10th Corps and 6th Corps are they've been putting a lot of pressure on the port located north of the plastic factory. And that's basically a bust now because the Chinese have broken out of the beachhead there that was very, very fragile. They got control of that port on turn one. That was a really risky thing. I think if I was going to try this again, I wouldn't have risked that because that was probably a good way to lose some crack units. And I think I was lucky to have succeeded in that, but it's paid off huge in that it's opened up this whole swath of breathing space for the landing force. And it's forcing these guys now to fall back on the river line just to the south of Taichung. And the Taipei Marines led an attack on the airborne units here. Chinese airborne units inflicted losses and drove them up into the hills, seizing this vital crossroads. That's the only really successful counterattack that the Allies have been able to make. And the purpose here is to reestablish the line here. And also, there's events happening elsewhere at sea that's driving some of this activity. If we look at the naval map here, you can see that there's a surface action group and an amphibious group that's got some Marines, a Marine brigade. They've headed into the South China Sea. Their target is the Paracels, but they won't be able to get there until turn 4. And so that's something that's going on. There's really nobody to contest that right now. Now, if they land there and take that, that can potentially bring Vietnam, and I think the Philippines might enter the fray. It might just be Vietnam with the Paracels. Spratlys can potentially bring in Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. I'd have to double check the rule if this triggers a roll for the Philippines. But anyways, this could provoke, a wider war situation, but it's worth 10 points. And I say grab it because there's a +2 modifier to the UN die roll, and grab all the points you can before a ceasefire is imposed by the Security Council. Over here in the Ryukyus, the American Navy has a CVN battle group and 2 SAGs. These guys have area detection, and they have had to fend off some cruise missile strikes. They tried to make entrance into the Taiwan Straits, but rolled unsuccessfully for their contested sea movement in there. So they haven't been able to bring their force to bear into the Straits. If this group was to get in here, they could trade missile shots with detected Chinese naval units in the Straits of Taiwan, and they could definitely affect the die roll for control of the Straits. Chinese were in possession of a carrier battle group in the Straits. These guys were driven off by naval strikes from that American carrier group and almost sent them to the turn track. One more hit would have removed it to the turn track and a cool 5 points. I'd have to double check the rule to see how many turns before it can come back into play. So you got one strike group that's out of the action right now. The Chinese do have 1, 2, 3 SAGs and a amphibious group with a couple Marine brigades, and their purpose is to set up alternate landings on either the south or the west or the eastern shores. There's a couple ideal spots. I probably wouldn't land somewhere around here with just 2 brigades. There's really no way to support that. However, there are some juicy targets in the south. In the southwest, this is a pretty juicy target. There's no ground units in this area, and seizure of this base down here would be a huge boon, and it's not too far to affect supply. As long as they've got control of the air, getting emergency supply of those brigades, I don't see that being a problem. We could even remove the beachhead temporarily and put that down there if we wanted to. So, but I kind of like having the beachhead here because it's an alternate port, and the 2 ports have been bombed. They haven't been knocked out, but they might get knocked out this turn. We got 1 more strike phase, so we'll have to see what happens there. But my point is the action at sea is driving what's happening here because the threat of landings here and here and here, it's forcing the Allies to concede some ground in order to secure more vital targets from becoming easy pickings. One thing I want to house rule, and I still haven't fully thought through how I'm going to do it, but I believe the rule is that as long as the straits are controlled by the Chinese, if they're controlled or contested, if these waters are controlled or contested, then the ports that they control, the Chinese that is, the ports that they control can be used as supply sources. So you can trace supply to those locations. Now, supply is not a big deal for the ROC because they can trace to their urban hexes, and they got plenty of those. They've got Kaohsiung, they got Tainan, Taichung, and Taipei. So they have plenty of places to get their supplies from. However, I don't see how you can engage in offensive military action for an extended period of time without controlling these waters. I think that contested is making it, allowing them to trace supply these ports when the sea is contested, I think it makes it a little bit too easy for the Chinese. I think they'd have a harder time getting effective supply. So I'm going to house rule something. I'm going to use the charts here from the standard and advanced game tables. Look at the contested sea movement table. This is used for moving your naval units into a zone that's not controlled by you. In other words, it's either contested or controlled by your opponent. I think I can use that table for the same effect, rolling forward in each supply phase to determine whether that port is able to affect supply until the next supply check. So as long as the waters are in a contested status, right now they're not, but should they become merely contested, I'm going to make the Chinese dice for it. Because I think that Allied submarines would play havoc. You could have shortages of supply, especially the more troops you bring over. That's more troops you've got to supply. I think the game's a little bit soft on that, and so I'm going to house rule that, make the Chinese really work to control those straits, because I think that would be absolutely vital in a real world situation. So one last thing is the air war has gone a little rough for the Allies. We aborted a lot of strikes. We boarded a lot of aircraft. But we have seen a few key Chinese units get aborted. Some of their stealth aircraft were aborted just recently. So the next turn, there's going to be some more U.S. aircraft coming into play. And hopefully for the Allies, they'll be able to start turning the tide a little bit. But at some point, if other ground forces don't get involved, it's going to be really, really hard for the Allies to win this thing at this point, because the momentum is usually hard to maintain in this system. But with the Chinese units, bringing more and more forces onto the island, and with Taiwan not having a whole lot in the way of reinforcements, numbers are starting to tell. And the quality of opponent is, it's a pretty high caliber opponent coming at you. So I'm kind of thinking at this stage of things that this one here, the writing's on the wall as far as who's going to win this thing. China is definitely winning this thing. The question at this point is just how much of a win are they going to get before this thing is all said and done. Definitely have a lot of fun. We're going to finish out this turn at least and see what happens with the UN die roll. But I thought I'd bring you up to speed as to what's going on. it's been a really, really interesting game, and it's been a little bit of a challenge, juggling all of the optional rules that I've imposed and kind of piecemealing this together from multiple different orders of battle. But it's actually worked out pretty well, and it's been a lot of fun.